In this video, we're going to talk about the domain name system and whois lookups. And so if you're not familiar, the domain name system is what makes it possible for us to type in a domain name and allow a computer to use an IP address to actually visit the requested domain or website. So, for example, if you want to perform a search on the Google search engine, you're probably going to type in google.com. However, when your computer's reaching out to the web server that it's going to contact to make your search, it's going to use an IP address. And so the DNS service performs lookups between domain names and IP addresses. And so in order to have this lookup registered, someone needs to provide a great deal of information to a domain name registrar, and that registrar makes that information, or at least some of it, available to third parties just publicly on the internet. And so in this video, we're going to take a look at the ICANN domain name registration data lookup tool to see what sort of information we can glean from taking a look at these domain names. So since I mentioned Google, let's start out with Google. So I'm going to enter in the domain google.com here and click lookup. And let's see what sorts of information is available to us. And so we have the domain name, certain statuses, and then we get into more details. So right here, we have a number of name servers. And so a name server is a server designed to respond to DNS requests. And so when your computer wants to talk to google.com, they're going to need an IP address of a name server, which they then ask for a particular IP address of a particular server within it. For example, something that responds to google.com versus mail.google.com or Google Docs, etc. And so knowing these name servers is useful because from a name server, you can get the IP address of a particular machine. And so if you know the IP address of a name server, you can leverage that information to get an idea of the address range that a particular company owns and where you could potentially find machines under their control on the internet. And so we'll dive into that a little bit later. But let's keep on moving through this and see what else we have with regards to information. We have expiration dates for the registration here. And so this could be useful simply knowing when a particular domain is set to expire. In some cases, a black hat hacker might take over a domain to post phishing pages there. And so we see that Google's registration is not going to expire for quite some time. And Google's been around since, or at least this particular domain has been around since about 1997. Scrolling down, we see that Google uses a company to handle its registration information. So there's certain information that either the company that owns the domain or their chosen agent has to provide. So we know that Mark Monitor Incorporated handles Google's domain. They have an abuse contact information, including email address and phone number. We see here that there is no DNSSEC enabled on this domain, which is important because that means that the domain might be vulnerable to certain forgery attacks. And then we see information about authoritative servers, so their registry server URLs, etc. And so from an ethical hacking perspective, all of this is useful, but one thing that we're really going to use here is the name of these name servers. And so in the next video, we're going to look into making DNS requests. And so getting an idea of the IP range that Google owns can help to identify their attack surface, which is useful in reconnaissance for finding vulnerabilities that could be exploitable. So if we type digns1.google.com and hit enter, we get a DNS response. And so what we care about here is whether we get an answer section and what it contains. And so this answer section in particular says that there is a name server named ns1.google.com at IP address 216.239.32.10. And so we can learn a couple of different things from this. We learn that the particular name server is running at this particular IP address. And by implication, we learn that Google controls at least some IP addresses in this area. And so knowing this is useful because if there are DNS records created for these particular addresses, then we can potentially learn what they do. And even if there aren't DNS records in existence, we can potentially identify servers that could be included in testing, where if we determine that a server exists and is publicly accessible, but may not be intended to be accessed by the public, this could be a vulnerability in an organization's network. So before we dive into all that, let's take a look at the other name server records using dig. And so to do this, we'll run the same command, but say dns2.google.com, and I'm going to add the +short keyword to the beginning here. And so what this keyword does is it simplifies the result by only telling us the answer that we're looking for. So if I hit enter now, all I see is the IP address of ns2.google.com. And so this is useful if you don't feel like wading through all of the information that dig provides. And so running this for the other two name servers here and taking a look, we start to see a pattern. We see that Google, their name servers are at 216.232. An even number, 32, 34, 36, or 38.10. And so this provides some suggestions about Google's network. One, they probably have control over these ranges, the 234.239.32, 34, 36, 38. Star ranges of IP addresses. They possibly, at least, probably though, have control over the odd number ranges between them, the 33, 35, and 37, and they always choose to put their public-facing DNS servers at .10 addresses. And so what happens between these IP addresses? And so let's start by performing what's called a reverse DNS lookup on one of these addresses that we already know. And so to do reverse, I put this -x here. And so order matters here. If I did dig -x +short, I'm going to get more information instead of less. And all I really want to see is if I get an answer. And so ns1.google, in this case we type in the IP address, so 216.239.38.10, so ns4. And that's the result we get. So what's on either side of that? We do .11, get nothing. .9, get nothing. And so that means that for these two IP addresses, Google hasn't created a DNS record. So they're not sharing what those IP addresses are for. However, there's no guarantee that there isn't something running on those services. And so by investigating those particular IP addresses, you might learn more information for an ethical hack. However, simply by performing these simple DNS lookups and identifying where their name servers are located, we learned a few things about their network. It's definitely possible to learn quite a bit more about what goes on in their network using the dig command. So if we did dig-h, we'll get the help information. And so most of what we see on this screen right now is options for outputting, but we see that we can tweak the output for certain pieces of information. And so this is the overall command. We can specify the server that we want to talk about. We can mention a particular domain, and various other features that we can define in our commands. And so I'm not going to go through all of the possible dig flags here and how to use them. Here is a listing of them. So what we've already used is doing -x for reverse lookups. We can also specify -4 or -6 for particular IP addresses, looking for a certain class of query, specifying port numbers, etc. And so recommend you just take some time to play around with dig and get a familiarity with how DNS records work and the types of information that you can extract from them. Thank you.